Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar with the focus today on greenhouse gas accounting, and in particular on how mitigations can be consistently and defensively incorporated into greenhouse gas protocols at both farm, national, and company level. What we're going to talk about today is a project that has been around about 3 years in the delivery, instigated by global dairy companies who wanted to find a consistent and unified way of incorporating mitigation into their company lifecycle analyses. We have two speakers today. One of them is Dr. Andrew Fletcher from Fonterra. He is their global leader in engineering research, where he actually addresses a wide range of engineering topics, but includes environmental and greenhouse gas issues. He's also the co-chair of the International Dairy Federation. Following an introduction by Andrew, we will have Dr. Aaron Simmons, who's a senior research scientist at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. And his work focuses on low emissions agriculture, and particularly specializing in life cycle analysis. Just on some protocols, we will have around about 30 minutes of talk, and following that, we'll have a Q&A session. If you have questions, can you please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, please? And then I will ask the panelists those questions, and I will be trying to summarize them in case some are similar. And we'll have around about a 20-minute Q&A session following that. So many thanks for joining today, and I'll now pass on to Andrew Fletcher, who will make the introduction from Fonterra.
You're right, everyone. Thank you, Harry. Just to clarify Harry's intro of me, my IDF-related role is co-chair of the action team on life cycle analysis rather than co-chair of the IDF as a whole. It's a much bigger task than I've got, which is kind of relevant to also to the origins of MiLCA. So the MiLCA Protocol came out from conversations that occurred at the end of the last update to the IDF LCA methodology, and it came out of this question that and what we've ended up doing is sort of updating that methodology about every 5 years. A number of the participants then had a conversation which is to say, over the next 5 years, before we do the next update, we need to have a method for how we're going to account for the use of environmental mitigations in our life cycle analysis, because we want to encourage the uptake of these. We want to be in a position to actually encourage people to use them, to get them into our supply chains, to be able to reduce our footprints. And we want to have we need to have a consistent method for how we then take that and turn that into claims we make around our products. And that can't wait for the 5 years for the next update of the IDF methodology. So that was part of the cause. And so that big driver is, for us as a dairy company, we want our farmers to be able to, as soon as credible technologies are available, and credible is a really important word when we talk about MiLCA, and Aaron will give you some substance, I'm sure, about what credible actually means. When credible mitigations are available, we want them used in our supply chain, and we want to have a process for making credible claims around the benefits of those. It's critical that we are making claims that are defensible, that we can honestly stand behind and say we are confident that these reductions have occurred, because the last thing the sector needs is to be accused of greenwashing or of over-exaggerating the benefits of these new technologies. And so that's really the context for MiLCA. It gives us a pathway as a company for how we would take information around these technologies, the information we would require about their use, around their efficacy, and turn those into claims we can then align with our product footprints. And with that introduction, I will pass over to Aaron to go through the substance of what MiLCA is all about.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I will, or can you tell me, Tanya, when the slides are actually up? I can just see myself at the moment.
Yep, just doing it now.
So I only have 4 or 5 slides with some points on it, and I'll kind of talk to those points and use those points to flesh out in a bit more detail what's in the actual MiLCA protocol. There's, I guess there's a lot more background to it and a lot more understanding that, you know, I could try and communicate, but I don't want to get dredged or bogged down in detail. I am happy to have conversations offline at a later date if people are more interested in getting a bit of insight into it.
You should be able to see them now, Aaron.
No, that could be my internet.
No, I can't see them either, Tanya.
Okay.
I have it here. I can try to share. Oh, no, here we go. It's coming through now. Just needs to be in presenter mode. Okay, so that's the, just go to the next one for us, Tanya, please. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so when we put some thought into what we needed to include in a protocol to ensure that, you know, we met the brief of having a framework that could be used so that there would be trust from consumers and from the supply chain in greenhouse gas emissions reductions that were claimed by the dairy sector, and that, you know, those claims were, or the trust was built on credibility. We came up with 4 key principles that we included in the protocol, and those four principles are listed there. And really, you know, I'll talk about each of those principles in the slides and give more detail on each of those principles in the slides that are coming up. But what we did, we went through international guidance documents around greenhouse gas emissions reductions, not just for the agricultural sector, but in general. And we looked at what some of those principles or the overarching principles across all of those guidance documents were. But then we also added in some additional principles that we felt we needed to include in a protocol that dealt with particularly food products, but agricultural sector as well, because there was a very strong focus on the consumer. If you want to go to the next slide, please, Tanya. So the first one was that technologies are safe, and safety isn't just about human safety. So there's definitely the, you know, to have that trust, we needed to include components that ensured that human safety was considered. But really that falls under regulatory approval. So if there's a technology that a dairy farmer wants to implement, there's going to be a regulatory framework around that, and many of those regulatory frameworks include human safety as part of their assessment process. In many instances, you know, that, or I guess what you need is actually to have that written evidence documenting that the technology or the product that you want to use in your system is actually legal to use. And so in Australia, that might be a certificate from the APVMA that regulates veterinary medications and whatnot in Australia. So you'd have to attach that to any report that was generated from MiLCA when you're making a claim. For environmental impacts, and again, this could include human health impacts, what we needed to do was actually make sure that there was demonstrated evidence that there weren't going to be any adverse impacts from either the manufacture or the use of a particular technology. So we didn't want to have people implementing something that reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but then, you know, there was a significant trade-off with another environmental indicator that could then cause an issue around the credibility of the dairy sector and, you know, reduce the trust in what farmers were doing. And so for that, we decided to rely on international standards, the ISO 1444 standard around life cycle assessment. So that sets a robust framework. So people need to be able to demonstrate that there has been a life cycle assessment done. There's a number of indicators in there that we suggest people include, but just because of how life cycle assessment works, we weren't specific about that. You know, people need to justify why they included those specific indicators, or why specific indicators were excluded as well. And then we also needed to assess, or needed farmers to assess, sorry, not farmers to assess. We also need the report to demonstrate that the impacts to the farming system have been considered. And the two things there were animal health. So we can't have products or technologies implemented that are going to have adverse impacts on animals. You know, that would not sit well with consumers in particular, but also product quality. So with milk, that's making sure that there aren't residues in milk, essentially, which then comes down to human health. So a lot of that comes down to demonstrating technologies are safe, it's safe for human consumption, there's no adverse impacts on humans, and that also that there's no adverse impacts on other aspects of the environment. Okay, next slide, please, Tanya. So the next part of it was that we needed to come up with guidelines to ensure that technologies are effective. And this is something that I'm very passionate about. You know, there needs to be a very strong evidence base that what somebody is doing is actually credible, because that credibility then generates trust. And there are many, many examples of people that make claims around an emissions reduction because they have undertaken practice X, or there's a particular product that they've implemented, but there really is no evidence to support that. And that's where greenwashing really starts becoming a risk. And in Australia, at least, the ACCC that looks out for greenwashing and whatnot have set, well, more than greenwashing, but they've actually set some pretty clear guidance around what constitutes greenwashing. And so this is well and truly on their radar to make sure that greenwashing claims aren't made. And there's significant penalties in Australia, even for international organisations, if they are found to be greenwashing by the ACCC. So really that evidence base that you need to be able to demonstrate that technologies are effective, we fell back on using science, which is a pretty obvious thing to do. But we came up with 3 approaches that people can use that we deemed would provide sufficient evidence to support, you know, that to generate confidence in the efficacy of a technology. So those 3 were that there was one peer-reviewed meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where there are multiple studies and the results from those studies are all aggregated together, and there's a, pardon me, and there's statistical analysis done on that to pull out the overarching relationships from multiple studies. There had to be a minimum of 3 peer-reviewed scientific studies. And for that meta-analysis, as well as the 3 peer-reviewed scientific studies, we actually stipulated that they had to be published in a journal of a certain quality. So scientific journals, you know, there are predatory journals where people essentially are approached to publish their papers, their scientific papers, but they pay for the privilege of doing that. So it's very much a business, I guess, a financial model for those particular publishers, and they're excluded. They're explicitly excluded because they don't even appear on that register. So it really sets a benchmark around expectations for the quality of evidence that people use when it comes from scientific studies. The third one was that people could rely on a methodology for a carbon crediting scheme. And it couldn't just be any carbon crediting scheme. Somebody can't come up with a technology and then go out and also, if they could be bothered, set up a carbon crediting scheme with a methodology. The carbon crediting scheme to which the methodology is applicable needs to be certified under a global carbon crediting scheme framework called ICROA. So we really relied on independence, I guess, as a way of generating that confidence in the research that's used or the methods that's used to support a claim of an emissions reduction. I guess the other thing with using a methodology from a carbon crediting scheme, there's different ways of calculating an emissions reduction within a carbon crediting scheme. And even if that carbon crediting scheme used a different approach for conservativeness, which is something that I'll talk about in one of the next slides, they had to modify that methodology so that it met the same criteria that is included in MiLCA. So it wasn't just picking up a methodology and applying it. There may have had to have been some modifications to that methodology for it to be applicable. Okay, next slide, please, Tanya. And so I just referred to methodology being modified so that it's conservative. So conservativeness essentially means that you don't receive all the credits or the average number of credits or the average reduction that you would get if you did that calculation. You need to adjust it so that you get fewer credits, because if you have a conservative claim and you get fewer credits, it actually generates confidence in that claim because it avoids or it reduces the risk of overcrediting occurring. The conservativeness is a key principle in multiple, or I guess nearly every existing global carbon credit framework. So that's Verra, for example, but it's also part of the Australian ACCU scheme. And it is also a key principle in things like the UNFCCC Clean Development Mechanism, or it was, and it's now a key principle of Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. So it's been built in there explicitly to avoid that overcrediting. It's worthwhile pointing out that being conservative isn't necessary when you're doing a greenhouse gas account. The IPCC methodology guidance for greenhouse gas accounting allows people, or suggests that people use an average because they want the best bet. But it kind of shifts a bit when you want to make a claim for the supply chain, in that you then shift to being conservative, because that's a way of ensuring that the claim that goes down the supply chain isn't overestimated. So for the MiLCA protocol, we used a process or a method that's included in a number of existing carbon credit methodologies, where you adjust the claim that you can make based on the probability of exceedance. So briefly, if you use the mean value, then that's a probability of exceedance of 0.5. So what that means is that if you went out and resampled various populations, that the mean of that of each population would most likely fall on either side of, sorry, I've gotten myself confused. Yeah, the average for a population would fall on either side of what you've estimated using that sample. Now, once you adjust for a probability of exceedance, and in this instance we use 0.7, and I'll explain that, it shifts that value a little to the left if you think about a reduction. And so it really means that or it means that you end up claiming a lower emissions reduction. When you use the probability of exceedance, it adjusts that based on the uncertainty of the data that you're using to make a claim. And so we aligned, or we used the probability of exceedance of 0.7 because it actually aligns with IPCC terminology. If we had have used a probability of 0.5, or if we had have used the mean value, then that aligns with IPCC methodology guidance terminology of the reduction was as likely to have occurred as not. So it really says it's either way, but by shifting it to 0.7, we can then use terminology that is, equates to that the emissions reduction was likely to have occurred. And so that, by being able to use that kind of terminology, that actually generates confidence that in the consumer that they're buying something that has, got lower greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Okay, I'll get you to move on to the next slide, please, Tanya. So the final principle that we included was that data needs to be appropriate. And so when we talk about data here, we're really talking about farm data or activity data. And so activity data in this instance could be, for a dairy, it might be the number of cows. It could be the cow weight. It depends on the greenhouse gas emissions source that you're reducing by implementing a technology and the calculations that sit behind that as to what activity data is actually used in those calculations. So for the 3 NOP example that we developed as part of the MiLCA protocol, feed quality parameters were part of that activity data. And so that was, I can't actually remember what they were off the top of my head, like crude fat and parameters like that. Now, how this feeds into the MiLCA protocol is that we developed data quality categories that people had to assess the data they're using to generate an emissions reduction against. And we did this because if people use poor quality data, then that reduces the confidence that the consumer has in a claim. So, for example, if you're in New Zealand and you implement a technology and you don't actually have any data, but you use data, and this is a nonsensical example, but I'll use it, and you use data for a barn system in Victoria, Australia, then that's really irrelevant to the point of being nonsensical, and that would not actually instill any confidence in consumers that this claim, the claim that was made actually reduced the greenhouse gas emissions. So the data quality categories we incorporated into the protocol are based on an existing life cycle assessment framework that's widely used globally. And there were 4 categories that we incorporated into that. That's reliability. And so reliability refers to how you're estimating a particular piece of data or activity data. So if you directly measure something, then that's really high quality. If it's estimated through a validated model, for example, then it's lower quality. If it's just a guess that you're pulling from the internet, well, that's extremely low quality. We also use completeness. That is a way of a phrase that essentially means, well, how relevant to the system is it? So if you're getting it from your actual farm or from the particular farm that you're applying it to, then that's deemed to be complete data. If it's from other systems, then it's has a low level of completeness. There's also a temporal correlation. We want data to be as recent as possible. If it's for the year that you're calculating emissions reduction for, then that's excellent data. And then there's also the geographical correlation. So where in the world essentially has the data come from. So the way that we have set it up, or the way that Andrew set it up, actually, it was his suggestion that we followed, was that you have to calculate an adjustment factor based on the data quality, and that data quality then adds an additional discount to the discount that you get from the uncertainty, and using that the P equals 0.7 to calculate the probability of exceedance. And importantly, if you have the highest quality of data for every single category, then you get no additional discount. But as soon as you start veering away from having that really high quality data, then you start getting a bit of a discount compounded onto that probability of exceedance value. So the reason that we did that was that it actually incentivizes farmers to go out and collect high quality data so that they can make sure that they don't get that discount when they're making a claim, or when the dairy processor is making a claim on their behalf. And that means, by having this mechanism, it generates the trust of the consumer, because again, they've got confidence. The data that's being used to calculate it is as high quality as possible, and if people don't have high quality data, then there is a penalty. Something I forgot to mention on the previous slide about using that probability of exceedance approach, and the fact that the probability of exceedance is based on the uncertainty of the data that's used to support a claim, is that we included that because it incentivizes researchers, scientists, product developers to ensure that the data or the study that they do is set up in a robust way, that it collects high quality data from a scientific perspective to minimize the uncertainty, the statistical uncertainty in the estimate that it generates. So if we didn't have that, then people could say, okay, well, I'll go and do a small experiment that doesn't have many replicates, and there could be a large amount of uncertainty around it. So there's actually no incentive for them to increase the number of replicates. So there's a cost that they need to, there's an optimum experimental design that's not going to be too costly, but that's going to maximize the uncertainty, and a statistician can help them use that. But essentially, by doing that, it actually incentivizes researchers and product developers to go out and make sure that they're getting good quality, robust scientific evidence to support a claim, because then the lower the uncertainty due to having a good scientific experiment set up means that the discount is lower as well. And that's the end of my slides. I've taken about 20 minutes there. But yeah, overall, I guess the key points are that we did sit back and think about what needed to be included in a protocol that, we wanted to set up to achieve essentially confidence in the consumer, or, making sure that consumers were confident in a claim that was made. And that's an overview of those 4 principles that we incorporated into the protocol.
Thank you, Aaron. Now the questions are coming in thick and fast. The first question I want to put to Andrew, with his Fonterra hat on. There is a view amongst some that methane emissions don't matter. Why is Fonterra even bothering with this when methane emissions don't matter?
Okay. Well, they matter regardless of your view of the science and whether or not they matter materially there. They matter commercially to our customers. And when we start to think about where the money that funds the supply chain comes from, it all comes back from the people who purchase products. If they believe, and so they are looking for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the products they're purchasing. That does flow through us, and potentially if we are unable to deliver those, then they will look for products elsewhere or pay less for the products they purchase from us. So in that sense, there's economically, there is a very strong commercial imperative why these things do matter.
Thanks, Andrew. And I've got quite a lot of detailed things, but there's some high-level ones I want to ask you as well. There is a very wide range of mitigation approaches being examined globally. Does this MiLCA protocol apply to all types of mitigations, or is it limited to certain types of mitigation?
Was that to Andrew or to me?
It could be to either of you. I think to
Okay.
you, Aaron, but I mean, I'm sure Andrew will have a view as well. But
Okay, so
particularly to you,
I'll
Aaron.
go first, Andrew. I'll go first. So it was targeted to technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions that cannot be currently captured in a greenhouse gas account using a carbon footprint methodology. So if we looked at the Australian greenhouse gas inventory and the calculations for enteric methane in dairy animals, feed quality has a very strong driver of enteric methane emissions. So if a farmer can demonstrate that he is using better quality feed, that animals are ruminating more efficiently and whatnot, that will already be picked up in a greenhouse gas account that's done for that particular farm. So there's actually no need to use the MiLCA protocol in that instance. Carbon sequestration, that's already covered by the CSEC guidance that was developed by the IDF. And so the gap that this fills is where people want to implement a technology, and it's not a sequestration technology, and it's not something that will already be picked up in greenhouse gas accounts because it's included in calculations already. There's actually no way to capture that. And so 3-Not we've used as an example. It isn't currently accounted for. It can't be accounted for using current calculations because of what it does to the animal's rumen. So there needs to be a way of integrating those kind of technologies into a carbon footprint or a greenhouse gas account for a product. Anything you want to add, Andrew?
Probably just to focus on that point, right? This was intended to capture technological innovation rather than farm management practice change.
Right, thank you. Just continuing on that theme, how appropriate is the MiLCA protocol for other accounting systems? We have the IPCC. There are good practice guidelines for national inventories. We've got in many countries there are farm level accounting schemes. How appropriate is the MiLCA protocol, or potentially how could the MiLCA protocol be adapted for other accounting schemes outside the dairy life cycle analysis for which this was originally developed?
I'll wrap that.
Go for it, Andrew.
Yeah, I'll go first go at this one. Okay, so I think it's been developed. It could be applicable for any farming system in that context of technological innovation. I think one of the main things that is a difference that the MiLCA protocol is developed for, with the express purpose of where you have essentially product reduction claims that are associated with the commercial transaction of products, whereby you have a product feature which is an emissions that you are changing as a consequence of an intervention, and you're wanting to make a responsible and conservative claim around that feature. And in that context, the drive for conservatism is that's part of where that drive for conservatism comes from. I want to be confident that the thing I am selling you actually has the benefits associated with it that I'm claiming. There is a difference between that and national inventory accounting, where there is a governing, and Harry can probably leap on this himself, is there is a governing principle around national accounts, which are trying to discover a sort of a best estimate rather than a conservative estimate about what's actually happening. And there the principle is to not knowingly under or overstate emissions. In a sense, in MiLCA, we are deliberately making a choice to understate what could be the emissions reduction by being conservative. And so there's that difference there. So, but outside of that, the rest of the principles that are in MiLCA around, body of scientific evidence, needing good activity data, all those things are still relevant in many contexts and could be picked up by inventory groups as part of their own approach if they haven't already got similar criteria in place. Harry, I don't know if you want to add to anything of that I've said either.
No, I think you've covered it really, really well, Andrew. I don't have anything to add. Do you have anything to add to that one, Aaron?
Yeah, there is nothing. So when we were developing it, we looked at we're familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol as an alternative greenhouse gas accounting framework, and there is nothing that's inconsistent with what's in the MiLCA protocol and the GHGP, and we don't specify anywhere that you can't use it with the GHGP. I guess the thing that would need to be considered would be things like if people are using it to report against the SBTI, an SBTI target, they would need to consider how the particular intervention that's been used in that dairy or the group of dairies that the processor is reporting on fits within their particular SBTI target around, whether they have a flag emissions reduction target or not, that kind of thing. So it can be calculated for an SBTI target, but really people need to just think about how relevant it is to include that based on the SBTI guidance.
Thank you. And this is a specific question for you, Andrew, and it's around the alignment, and a specific Fonterra question, the alignment of the MiLCA protocol with Fonterra's existing reward systems. You have a reward system through the Tiaki cooperative point of difference. Synlait also have their lead with Pride. Is there a synergy between the evidence needed for MiLCA and the evidence needed to get those rewards through Fonterra's reward system?
I think so. So at the moment, actually, it would be nice if we were in a situation where this was actually a challenge we needed to address, because at the moment the issue we've got in New Zealand is that we do not, aside from essentially one technology, which actually there is a national inventory method for, which is the EcoPond technology.
Yeah.
We do not have currently any technological innovations that are applicable for use on dairy farms. Right? I think there is a body of information that processors like Fonterra, MiLCA, Synlait, whatever, collect from our suppliers around farm activity in order to actually support the current estimates, the current calculation or current estimation method for the on-farm emissions. That will need to change a little bit. So there will need to be when we start to see the introduction of new technologies, there's some additional data that will be required from farms to actually that activity data that Aaron talked about. So, for example, if an inhibitor is being fed, then there's got to be some evidence that it's actually been purchased and fed, and at what level, in order to then support a calculation. So there's some data that's going to need to change, and when we get to those places where we have technologies that are adoptable, that is the point at which that becomes a trigger for us to also update our incentive schemes to reflect and to bring those into the reward pathway for those farmers adopting those technologies. Why wouldn't we? I mean, that's why we're trying to drive this, is how do we, it's not just about having technologies available for farmers, but actually we want them in use, and we want the recognition both for those farmers using them and across the supply chain for their use. So hopefully that answers it. The challenge is at the moment, because the technologies are not available for use yet, this is a not yet.
Right. Thanks, Andrew. Just one, I think you've partially covered this one already, Andrew and Aaron. There was a question around the relationship between mitigations incorporated into the national inventory and data coming from things like EPA approval, ACVM, and how do they interact with the MiLCA protocol? And I think the first one was, if a mitigation is incorporated into a national inventory, does that mean it's automatically incorporated into MiLCA, or it's a strong reason why it would be incorporated into MiLCA? I think you've partially answered it because you talked about different standards for those, but it's that relationship between data, which is national inventory, coming from ACVM registration, EPA and the relationship with the MiLCA data, the MiLCA evidence?
So I'll try and answer this in a sense that, and I'll try also just generalize it in the sense that, so in the New Zealand context, the ACPM, so the Agricultural Compounds and Veterinary Medicines Authority, looks after the registration of products for use on farm, right? Aaron mentioned the similar body that does the same job in Australia. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is concerned around human health and welfare and environmental impacts, worker safety, those sort of things related to those compounds. Those two, in the New Zealand context, the information that's required for those two to approve the use of something does not support a claim, a numeric claim, generally speaking. It is a necessary condition, and it would fit into the protocol, the fact that those fit into that context that Aaron had around regulatory approvals for use of a product in the farming system. They're dealing with things around concerns around animal welfare, product safety, all those sorts of things. So they fit in as inputs into the protocol. The inventory one is an interesting one, because what MiLCA in part was set up to do was to enable the sector to move ahead of the process by which national inventories are updated. And so there are essentially two pathways for getting emissions into our organisational footprints. There is a national inventory pathway, which has certain processes around it in terms of peer review and international peer review, as well as data requirements, and still has this challenge around needing the activity data. So there's strong points of intersection, and MiLCA is set up to enable us to, independent of the creation of a national inventory method, to actually get stuff into a product footprint. So they're sort of parallel paths.
Aaron, do you have any additional comments?
So I think, well, I agree with Andrew's statement. I see this as actually guiding what happens in the national inventory. So this will lead the way. And then in Australia, our national inventory team can pick up on what's being done by industry. And one of the key things in Australia is that it's not necessarily the evidence base that's missing when we want to incorporate things like this into our national accounts. The issue that we have is actually getting the activity data and making sure that we have a good idea of where things are being implemented and by who, so that we're making sure that we're getting, a good estimate of what those average emissions reductions are. And so if industry leads, so if the dairy sector leads the way and their dairy processes are using MiLCA, which they're then reporting those reductions down the supply chain, there's potential for the Australian National Inventory team to pick up that data and integrate that into our national inventory, our national greenhouse gas accounts. And that actually can't happen without something like MiLCA and without the support of the industry doing those greenhouse gas accounts and making those claims. So I really see that, and I know that the team that does the Australian National Greenhouse Gas Accounts is, I've actually emailed them a copy of MiLCA this morning, and I know they're interested in it. So I really see it's a way of industry driving what government does. We can be the ones that are pulling the lever in this instance.
Thank you. I've got several questions around data and really specifically to you, Aaron. And one related to, could you define what you meant by a predatory journal? That was one part of the question. The other was the issue when, yes, you use 3 peer-reviewed journals. What happens through peer-reviewed papers? What happens when the evidence in the literature is conflicting? You may have more than 3 peer-reviewed journals, but the evidence is not ultimately completely clear, and that you could have conflicting results in the literature. How does that 3 peer-reviewed paper work there, and that issue of which journals are the ones that you regard as predatory? And I had another question around that as well, which was, should the journals, the papers be in open access journals? And I think behind that is, then it's publicly available that people can look at it. Whereas if they sit behind the normal academic journals, they may not necessarily be easily obtainable.
Okay, so I don't want to mention the publisher that is the most commonly known predatory journal publisher. I'm sure people would be aware of who it is, and if not, it would be relatively easy to find out if they Google predatory journals. That might be the best way to do it, as opposed to me making a public statement about a particular publisher or whatnot. So that's the second part of that, about what happens if there are papers that conflict with those 3 peer-reviewed journals, is a really good one, and we actually put a lot of thought into this issue. And the approach that we've taken is not perfect, not by any means, but we did build, and I'm trying to think of these off the top of my head here to try and remember everything that we included. So, or I'll give an example. So there may be 3 papers that show a particular technology is very effective, and then 3 that don't. But the 3 that are effective are applicable to a certain system or a certain region or something along those lines, and the 3 that aren't are applicable to another region or another system, that kind of thing. So that's why we incorporated the that data quality framework and whatnot. Oh, sorry, because you need to actually justify why you're using the particular pieces of evidence or piece of evidence to make that claim. And one of those justifications is around that it's applicable to the system for which the greenhouse gas emission reduction is going to apply. So people can't pick up. So if there's 3 papers that say, well, it's not applicable to pasture-based systems in Australia, but it is applicable to pasture-based systems in New Zealand, you can't cherry pick the New Zealand one and apply it to Australia, because then it falls out, because that's just not justifiable. Another one was the time period. So if we incorporated an element there that if you wanted to, if a research paper or research studies show that it works for a 6-week period, but then others suggest that it doesn't work when you apply it for 6 months, well, you can only use that technology and make a claim for that 6-week period. And then you have to actually make a case for the reapplication or the reuse of that technology for another 6-week period based on evidence. So we did actually think about this issue, and it still doesn't mean that it can't be gamed. And I will note that, I consider it a live document. So if there are things that come out that can kind of close any loopholes or potential mechanisms to game it, more than happy to hear those and look at modifying the document. But I guess, yeah, the overall answer is we did think about the potential to game it through that mechanism, but we did put some checks and balances in place to try and limit how easy it would actually be to do that. And it's really up to people to justify why they're using what they're using.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm going to have to wrap up. I've got 2 final questions. One is just around the protocol itself. How complicated is it to use in practice? The way you've described it, it has several elements. How complicated is it to use in practice, and does it need highly specialist input, i.e. a statistician, etc.? And I've got a follow on from that, which is, which entities do you foresee applying the protocol, and how do you expect them to make the results available publicly? So that's for both of you, I think.
Yeah, perhaps I'll have a go first. So the protocol, and there was a bit of conversation around during the development about who is actually the protocol is ready for. The protocol is primarily for, really it's for processors. It's for significant size actors within the value chain to be applying. So organizations like Fonterra, and because essentially, and it's partly related to the previous question that Aaron was answering as well. What the protocol does is it provides a framework for us to assert why we believe that a reduction we are claiming is valid, and that is based on the fact that it's done based on technologies that are appropriate for use, that have evidence behind them, etc. And that part of the protocol requires that if we are making a claim that is based on use of the protocol, we are to generate a report that is available for our stakeholders, which says why we believe we can make these claims. Basically, it lays out the evidence we've used, it lays out the activity data that we're using to support that, and how that comes together. So obviously, the process of doing that requires someone who has the time and the ability to get across the protocol. The one place where, in terms of specialists, technical specialist expertise is potentially required is the use of a statistician for some cases, particularly if you're dealing with meta-analysis and also quite complex activity data, how that comes together to understand the uncertainty that results from all of that, and therefore to understand the extent of that discount that occurs to give us our 70% confidence limit. Statistical expertise is potentially the main thing that's required, as I see it. The rest of it is a more general sort of ability to just check that all the pieces are present, enough understanding of the science and its relevance. And yeah, Aaron, don't know what you'd add to that.
Just that. Statistical input may be needed, but the equations. If it's a very cut and dried example, then the equations that are in the protocol can be applied to an existing technology, and it could be relatively simple. But yeah, it'll depend on the complexity of what's happening. When it comes to the entities that it could be applied to, or even the commodities, I'm doing work with the Australian grains and cotton sector at the moment, and that's a 5-year project, and I'm going to modify the protocol and use it as a basis for making claims in the grain and cotton sector associated with technologies. And one of the key elements of that will be around that conservativeness. So there's really nothing that's available for the grains and cotton sector to make claims similar to the dairy sector. And so I'll pick that up and modify that. And in that instance, I'll kind of use it as a ready reference, that publication, and update it. So go through the technologies and do a checklist of what's available, what's not for each of the individual technologies, and then actually do a calculation for that, P equals 0.7 probability of exceedance value based on the uncertainty, so that people can pick that up and apply it easier, noting they will still need to incorporate that data quality component into it.
Okay, right. I will actually ask you one more question. We've got a couple of minutes, so this is definitely the final one. And really, I think it comes back to both of you, but particularly you, Andrew, because you answered the question around this at first. Potentially, MiLCA takes a more conservative approach than, say, a national inventory. A national inventory never knowingly under or overestimates emissions, and if it takes that approach to mitigation, it is, in Aaron's words, it does the 50-50. The MiLCA protocol takes a more conservative approach. How then do we reconcile the differences between potential mitigation incorporation and the quantum of mitigation allowed in a national inventory and the quantum of mitigation allowed in a supply chain using a MiLCA protocol? How do we rationalize that?
Yeah, it's a goodie and a toughie, right? I think part of I will partly, if you'll excuse me, circumvent directly answering it. Part of the rationale for MiLCA was that it was intended for this case about us as a sector wanting to accelerate the adoption of these things and to potentially get ahead of what national inventories are doing. And so in that case, we are in some ways taking it upon ourselves as the authority upon which the claims are being made. And so we have a protocol that we would follow ourselves to say, how can we be confident that the things we are claiming are valid? When a national inventory does stuff, that becomes an external reference point for us. It's someone else that is actually making that assertion around the effectiveness of something. And so there's a slightly different risk profile for commercial operators. If that makes sense.
Aaron, do you want to have the final word?
I would just say horses for courses. It's quite, there's nothing inconsistent about having a different number flow through the supply chain for an emissions reduction and to the one that sits in the inventory. you know, they've got different purposes, and so when you recognise that there's different purposes, it's quite all right to have different numbers. I don't see that there's actually an issue there.
Right, and I think that's a really good place to finish the discussion. And I'd like to thank both of you for your presentations. I'd like to thank everyone who submitted a question. I'm sorry I couldn't ask the panelists all the questions, but once again, thank you for attending. You can download the MiLCA Protocol from the Global Research Alliance website. And I think at the moment there's something in the chat that gives you the link to that downloading. And we urge you to have a look at it. If you have any more questions, you can contact myself at the Ag Emission Centre, and I can pass on any further queries to Aaron and Andrew. If I don't know if you know others who want to participate in this, we're having a second webinar, which will be next week, which will be in evening time New Zealand, and that will be to allow people from the Northern Hemisphere and other time zones to join in. So please look out for that as well. But thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.